Thanks for joining me for a story that I'm not sure it ever happened, but there's a lot of truth to it. And the story goes that the teacher held out a beautiful silk scarf, and all the students agreed it was a beautiful silk scarf. And then he proceeded to take the silk scarf and tie knots in it. And after he had tied several knots, he asked the students if it was indeed still the same silk scarf or if it was different. The students all agreed it's still a silk scarf. He said, but there are knots in it. He said, yeah, it looks different, but it's still a silk scarf. Then he took the silk scarf and said to undo the knots. What if I pulled on them tightly? What if I worked and worked? And the students also agreed that that would not release the knots, to fight the knots. And then he just stopped, and the students talked amongst themselves about what was wrong with the way he was trying to undo his knots. So often when we have difficult times in our lives, the knots in our life, we work to problem solve them and we work to figure them out. What if we spend a moment just to notice them before we try to problem solve or before we try to fight it? What if we just notice our difficulty? Maybe the difficulty is that our friends are leaving us out. Maybe the difficulty is that the math assignment today is so difficult. What if we first just noticed it? Took some breaths, asked ourselves what we were saying to ourselves. Like if it's a math difficulty, are we telling ourselves that we're stupid? Is that going to fight it, or is that going to help loosen it? Lots of times if we can just say, boy, this math is really hard today. And just take a pause, our brains will open up. Our prefrontal cortex will become more available to us. Because when we're fighting the problem, that's like our amygdala, where all of our emotions are. And then we start telling ourselves bad things. But if we pause, take a breath, it'll make the problem a little bit easier to solve. So as you look at the knots, because we all have our knots. Some days are knottier than other days, if that's a word. But if we can look at them and take a pause, we might be able to soften, be kind to ourselves, and come up with ideas to loosen the knots. But whether we are a silk scarf without knots or several knots, we're still a silk scarf. Thank you for joining me. Namaste.